Hello and welcome to this screencast on how to write an outline for a presentation. I am primarily recording this for my own students at the two universities I teach at, but I'm hoping that some elements of it will be beneficial to you. Now, as I go through here, I'm just going to walk through it the way that I teach it in my classes. So if you are not one of my students, you might want to make sure that you double check this against any requirements in your own courses or for your own purposes as a presenter. Now, it is exceptionally cold where I'm at the moment, so that's the hat. I'm known for being the weird one when it comes to clothes, so I figured why not record that. So essentially what I have here is an empty template that I provide for my students for them to edit, and it's essentially formatted in an APA manner. And over here, on the other hand, is an outline that one of my students submitted to me several years ago and gave me permission to use. So this is essentially how to start and how to finish, and this is a development outline, not necessarily a presentation outline. Presentation outlines are typically keywords, which have significantly less information in it, but this is a good way to make sure that you've organized your thoughts, that they're in the appropriate order, and they each connect and are explained well. So that's it. Generally, what you're going to do is have some type of title for your presentation. That is entirely up to you and whoever you are working for or towards, but having a title kind of helps give you a theme as a presenter and gives you a goal to work towards. Have you accomplished that title in some way? And all good presentations should start off with some type of an attention grabber, and that is exactly what it sounds like. It is something that you show or do or say that grabs our attention and makes us focus on you. You are in an era of more distraction than pretty much any other time in history, so you have to compete with the cell phones, the conferences, the worries of the day, the thoughts of lunch, or whatever it might be, and give us a reason to take our minds away from everything else and focus on you. So attention grabbers can be anything from well thought out questions to an imagine if scenario to a shocking statistic. A lot of presenters start off by being funny to try to relax the audience and convince them that this won't be boring. So that's entirely up to you. But it is really encouraged to have some type of statement, claim, or even a picture or video that makes your audience really get involved in what you want to do. One of the ways that I do this, I like audience participation, so I will make my audience get up and do something, whether it is a speech warm-up stretch or a vocal exercise, or if I know the rough number of people that will be there, I will use them as some form of statistic. Like if there's 100 people there, I'll have 22 of them stand up to represent 22% of people that might be involved in my topic in some way, whether it could be motivational speaking or informative. So do something that gets your audience involved. Student example here has an imagine if scenario where they are painting a picture about stress. One thing, if you use questions or stories, make sure that you give an appropriate amount of time for them. One of the biggest rookie mistakes I hear and see in presentations all the time is that someone will start off with a question and motor right past it without giving their audience a chance to reflect. So if this person was talking about stress and asked a question instead of telling a story, they could do something like, how many of you all are stressed? And then go on with the next part of their speech. If you're going to ask a question, even if you don't want it to be answered, try to give yourself a 3-second pause after that for your audience to absorb the question, think about it, and build some type of connection. If you motor right through, you haven't gotten their attention. Now, something else that's typically bonded with an attention grabber but can happen separately is a relevance statement. And this is when you put into words why this topic is relevant to you, the audience member. So why is this relevant or immediate or urgent, worth my time? Again, competing with distraction. So what is it about this speech that we need to know? If you can think of this one about stress, this student was already connecting something that most of us have experienced, stress, with a scenario that might sound similar to us. So their relevance was built right in with their attention grabber. Sometimes my students separate that out and I'll have a relevant statement later in the introduction. But generally, get our attention, tell me why it's worth my time. After that, you come to your purpose statement, which is your thesis, and I want you to think of this as the one sentence that your audience should walk away knowing. If I forget everything else about you and your speech, I should at least walk away knowing what your thesis was. This is when you tell us what we are going to accomplish today. What are we going to learn? How are we going to walk away bettered in some way as a result of this speech? So this student over here basically states that excessive amounts of stress have shocking effects, so knowing appropriate stress management methods is the key to staying healthy. So their entire purpose of their presentation is to discuss what stress is and how we can combat that. So thesis statements, make them as simple and as direct as possible. In most literature classes, a thesis statement typically has its main points included with it. It's kind of a preview of the entire paper. In speech, we separate that out. So thesis statement is what you're there for, and then the preview is where you actually mention the main points. So we separate those two from each other. So if you're coming from a literature background, this might be a little bit more difficult or unfamiliar to you. Just split them. Thesis is purpose, credibility is going to be how expert you are in the topic, but the preview is the specific main points. So coming over here to the student, they mention each one of their main points by name. I'll be talking about how stress can alter the way your brain works, main point 1. How stress can have an impact on your entire body, main point 2. And how to better manage the stress in your life, main point 3. So think of your thesis as a broad swipe, just a general, here's what we're doing. And your preview narrows that down and says specifically, here's what we're really doing. So it breaks it down into manageable boxes or chunks. It gives your audience a roadmap for the rest of your presentation. It gives your audience the ability to know where we're going and to be able to identify the different elements of your speech. I'm sure that some of you have been in classes or presentations where it sounded like one big long blob of data. A preview kind of helps it not be a blob. It helps organize the information, which makes it easier to remember, which means you're going to have a longer lasting impact on your listeners. So as I said a second ago, the credibility is kind of separated out as well, and this is when you put into words how you are essentially the best person for the delivery of this presentation. If you are a speaker that will be introduced where someone else will go over your credentials and your accomplishments, you probably don't need a credibility statement as much. But if you are introducing yourself in the midst of this presentation, then this is where you explain your connection with the topic, what inspired you to get involved. If you've taken classes on it, there's that. If you have a degree in it, mention that. If it's a pet hobby of yours for the past 17 years, put that in there. But if you watch TED Talks or most formal presenters, you'll see that in the beginning parts of their presentation, there generally is a justification of their ability to be able to speak to you that day. So if you put it all together, this is essentially what you have. You've gotten my attention. You've told me why it's important to me. You've told me that you're worth listening to. You've told me why I'm here and what I will walk away knowing. Now, if you look, you'll see that the order of items in my template is different from the order of items in the student example. That is perfectly acceptable. Your introduction elements can be in any format that is handy-dandy to you, as long as the attention grabber comes first. That's the only thing that must happen. Get our attention first and then structure your introduction in any way that's useful to you. Now, with that, one thing I will say about an attention grabber is please never begin your presentation with, "Hi, my name is," and I will talk about. If you do that, no matter what you're talking about and what you are or who you are and what you want to do, here's what it's going to sound like. "Hi, my name is Ellen and I'm going to talk about cats." What happens if your audience hates cats, or they don't like your personality, or they don't even like your name? You've already lost half your audience and you haven't gotten 20 words into your speech. Never begin with a "Hi, my name is" statement. That's actually in one of the rubrics that I grade speeches with. If they have a "Hi, my name is," they don't get credit for an attention grabber. Get into your attention grabber first and then introduce yourself if you need to later on through the introduction, but don't ever start with your name and your topic unless you're giving a speech on how not to start a speech. Then you can do it. So once you have your introduction kind of going, you get into your first main point, which I recommend you express as a full sentence because that makes sure that there's enough information there for you to put into words. One of the things that does happen quite often in new speech classes is that they'll put their first main point as a word, like traits, and then the subpoints underneath that become a massive list of 72 items because there were 72 traits, and therefore that main point was too broad and now has turned into a list. I recommend that you express your main points as full sentences to make sure that you know where you want to go, and that helps encapsulate your thoughts into something a little bit more specific and organized into your speech format. So as you see here, first main point, stress can alter the way your brain works. So we know, if we were practicing this speech, that anything in this point should be about how stress alters the way that our brain functions. If it isn't in that category, it shouldn't be in that main point. So articulating that as a sentence helps you make sure that your information is there appropriately. Now, underneath your main point, you'll probably have subpoints and potentially sub-subpoints. I love how the writers of textbooks couldn't get any more creative than that. It's a sub-subpoint. Sub means below, so below point, and then sub-sub means below the sub-point. So whenever you are going through here, explaining your thoughts, giving some background and explanation, you do need to, at least in my classes, support them with research, and I require that they come alongside with 3 pieces of citation information. So if it's something that provides you with an author, I want to hear the author, title, and year. You can see that over here in the example, author, title, and year. If this is something like a website where you don't have an author or an author isn't provided, then you can use the website name, the web page name, and then the copyright or access year. So if I wanted to give a presentation on why college athletes should be paid more or paid at all or receive compensation, then I would be researching perhaps on ESPN. So I might have something like, according to ESPN.org, on their webpage, college athlete compensation accessed in 2020, then that gives us still a notice of where to go, where to look, and what to Google. A really handy way to kind of think about citing things would be to give your audience enough information to Google. If we like your topic enough to look it up, we need enough information to look it up effectively. So author, title, and year is okay. If you just give me the author and year, say Smith 2019, how many things do you think were published by people named Smith in 2019? Probably a fair few. I'm going to have to Google that later and see. So having that title in there is just an extra layer, providing your audience with more information to jot down in their notes and look up later. So this again might be a little bit different from a literature point of view, because in literature we can look and see and scroll through your paper to find your citations. In a speech, you rarely have that benefit. So as you go through your main point, explaining your subpoints and sub-subpoints, again, for a developmental outline, express them as full sentences. You can scale them back to keywords before you actually present. And if you'll notice, there are only a couple of citations in this main point. Not every single item is boom, boom, boom from the same person. I want to make sure that all of your presentations are primarily you, but are backed up with research instead of the reverse. If you're just reading research to me and there's none of you in the speech, then that really isn't a presentation. You're just reading to me what somebody else has done. So make sure that there is support for your points, but I need your points there. And one extra note on citing, please note how the citation happens before they quote and before they paraphrase. That is absolutely crucial and again, very different from literature citing. In English, typically your citations are kind of like this one. It's a parenthetical citation at the end of something. And that's because in a paper we can see quote marks. We can see when there's been a paraphrase happening. In a speech, we only have our words. So you want to make sure that if you're about to quote or paraphrase, that citation information happens first. If you don't, it sounds like this. Blah, 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 blah. Oh yeah, that was according to Bremner in 2005. What was according to Bremner in 2005? We don't know. So make sure that before you do anything, you give that citation so that way we know which pieces are yours and which pieces are not. Now, you're essentially going to follow that format for all of your main points unless instructed differently. So I'm going to kind of skip over the middles, but just introduce you to these ideas of bridge transitions. Now, this is an element that every speech instructor will address differently, so you need to make sure that this is according to how you have been taught. But the way that I prefer transitions to be for my students would be bridge transitions. And bridge transitions mean they bridge you from one point to the next. There's a clear connection, which means you have to use a full sentence and say something along the lines of, now that I have discussed this main point up here, I'm going to move on to this main point down here. It looks back before it moves forward, and that's the crucial point. If you say something like, let me move on to my next point, and that's it, that's a half transition. If you use a word like next or secondly, that is considered to be a signpost. A bridge transition is when you say something like this. Now that I have discussed how stress can affect your mind, because remember this first main point was about the brain, I will now tell you about how stress can affect your body. There's the second main point. We look back before we move forward. Again, the reasoning behind doing this is to make sure that your audience has clear containers to file the information in. The clearer you can make your main points, the less blob-like you can make your main points, the higher chance you have of having your audience retain a higher amount of information. We are going to be affected by this concept of primacy recency, which means that audiences typically remember the first and most recent things we're told, and we kind of miss everything in the middle. So transitions are a way of repeating what your main points are. So if someone zones out in the middle of a point, when they hear that transition, they can go, okay, that one was about the mind. Okay, second one was about the body. It helps us kind of give a tag. It sends up a flag saying, hey, I'm moving on, come with me, and make sure that your audience follows you through. So essentially you follow the same rules for the rest of your main points. You have your citations, you have your explanations, you have your transitions, you have your formatting, and then you finally get down here to this beautiful conclusion. And I signal my conclusions with the phrase in conclusion. You can get fancy and say something like, and now as I review my speech, or you can say to review, or in summation, or whatever it is that makes you feel fancy. But just have this, it's called a signal, and it's kind of like sending up a signal flare going, hello world, I'm almost done. If you've left me, would you come back for like one more minute, please? And that makes sure that your audience zones in. For those of you who've spent years in classrooms, I'm sure whenever your instructor says something along the lines of, the last thing I'm going to say today, everybody perks up and starts packing up because you know you're about to be set free. So do the same thing for your audience. Again, if they've zoned out, they're going to be able to zoom back in and hear you do the rest of your conclusion. So the purpose of a conclusion is essentially to very briefly restate your presentation for those of us who have zoned out, or maybe you were talking too fast and they didn't get all the information. It's a way to repeat information to make sure we've checked all the boxes. So in your conclusion, you restate your purpose that day. So you restate your thesis. You kind of reword it. You can copy and paste, but it's best if you just kind of reword the importance of whatever your topic was. You're going to mention each one of those main points by name again. In your preview, you mentioned each main point by name. In a review, you add one detail from each of them. So you say, I went over my first main point, which was blah. Here's a detail. I went over main point 2. Here's a detail from that. And here was main point 3. Here's a final detail. So again, if we zoned out or got distracted, you got to bring us back. So you can see how the student discussed how stress can affect the brain, such as, adding a detail here, not being able to learn, how it affects your body, like leading to obesity and heart disease, so there's your detail, and healthy ways to manage stress, including listening to music or compromising. So it's not like a huge re-giving your speech, it's just a detail from each. And then the last thing that you do is you close that presentation with something memorable. You can refer back to your attention grabber. That's what a lot of professional presenters do to kind of bring it full cycle. They pop right back to their attention grabber and refer to it in some way. They might answer the question they asked. They might give the ending to the story. They might give a parallel example of resolving conflict that was introduced up there, whatever it might be. If they started with a picture, they might go back to that picture. You can also have a strong closing phrase like a reminder of a statistic or an encouragement for a choice we might make in the future, just something that we might do to, again, close it off. You don't want to have that awkward ending where everyone's staring at you wondering if you're done. You want to have that mic drop moment and make sure that you've made it clear that you're done. So what this person did for their summary statement was to refer again to themselves and what stress can do to them. It refers back to a couple of their main points. And then they close off with saying, although stress itself cannot be completely avoided, the long-term effects can be. Deliver that with emotion and timing, and we know your speech is done. So last things last, references. References are APA, works cited is MLA, so follow whatever your instructor asks you to do there. So I'm not going to go through that simply because that could be very relevant or relative, to what you might be doing. So in, almost less than 21 minutes, that is the basic way to develop a very strong presentation outline that you can use across any type of curriculum and tweak it to your needs. But overall, you're good. Thank you so much. Have a good one.